Spring has befallen Japan, and that means one thing and one thing only, that I chose absolutely the wrong clothes to wear today. But more so than the mistake in my attire, I want to talk about something that I don't usually talk about because I don't generally like criticizing Bandai, who's kind of given me a career. And that is that Bandai's recent design philosophy has been really problematic for the game. Before we talk about the recent design philosophy of the One Piece Guardian, let's talk about what happened in the past. Starting with the starter decks ST15 through ST20. These were 6 supplementary starter decks that were designed to help buff old decks that were created in the past. Things like Blue Doflamingo were actually so powerful that they became top of the meta back in OP09. This made these start decks, making it not only very easy to start playing some of these decks, but also these decks were very powerful in the meta. And this isn't even to mention that Blue Doflamingo at the time was a 2-year-old deck, being thrusted back into the top of the meta for the first time in such a long time. These start decks buffing up old decks was a resounding success, and everyone universally loved these changes. However, asking Bandai to do this every single set is like asking me to drop the NL wrap that I made a couple of videos ago but ended up cutting. It's not gonna happen. And the reason for this is simple, because they're a company, and companies need to make money some way. And if the thing that was printed out 1 year ago is going to still be the best 1 year later, that doesn't actually mean that you're buying the new things, because you don't need to actually change your deck. So therefore, especially in physical TCGs, companies need to incentivize you to buy the new products, the new best things, so that you can actually stay competitively relevant and they make money. Now, there's 2 ways you can go about this. You can go the Yu-Gi-Oh way or the One Piece way. Yu-Gi-Oh notoriously bans a lot of cards. I actually have the ban list scrolling on the list here, and it's not going to end anytime soon, because there's so many cards that have been banned, and that's their way of balancing the game. Rather than making something that's absolutely broken that replaces the old broken deck, a lot of the times it's Konami pulling down the power of other cards to make things more competitively balanced. And this is a good thing and a bad thing, because for the game it means that the game's never going to be absurdly Powercreep to oblivion, though I mean, that still technically happened. Games finish in 1 turn. But it comes at the cost of consumer trust in a way, because you never know when the deck that you're buying into is going to be instantly banned and inevitably devalue all the cards in your deck, which can be very frustrating for a player. So what's the other option? Well, it's to just keep making the new cards stronger than the old ones. But so why is this a problem now? Because in the past we have had some really powerful decks like OP05, where we had things like Sakazuki, Enel, and Purple Luffy all introduced in 1 set. But this was, of course, an anniversary set. And anniversary sets, of course, are trying to get people hyped, getting people excited with the game with very powerful characters. And, of course, if you want those really strong characters in the game to be good, you need to make the deck strong. So in OP05, they introduced a lot of very powerful decks that were meta for a quite long time until inevitably Sakazuki was banned. However, these other decks like Purple Luffy and Yellow Enel never were banned. They never had any of their cards hit unless you count things like Daigo, but that was far past Enel's prime. The reason why these decks stopped being part of the meta is simply because the new support didn't necessarily replace them, but caught up to them. And this was factually a very slow process, because in OP06 we had some rather powerful decks like Black Moria and Blue Purple Reiju, which didn't necessarily replace the old meta, making direct counters to the things that are powerful in OP05, but instead made different ways of playing very powerful decks that ended up standing alongside the powerful decks in OP05 to create a more healthy meta. But so then the question is, what's the problem with the recent meta that wasn't true in the past? Why is this now a problem that I'm bringing up? Well, really for me, it's the fact that it feels like every single set you need to switch your old deck for whatever the new deck Bandai decided is going to be good this set. And that's really, Well, it seems like I somehow dropped this into a tree. Wow, look at how big that deck box is. And you're telling me you can find all types of TCG supplies at the link in the description below using the code KAI5 at checkout for a 5% discount? That's crazy for how high in quality these deck boxes are. I mean, look how large this one opens up. Okay, let's try that again. The deck box is durable, it's cute, it can fit in everything that you need without ever feeling packed. Okay, perfectly fine. But so I think that this issue started actually in OP11, but we just didn't notice it until a couple of sets later. Some may argue that this actually started in EB02 with Green Purple Luffy, but I'm going to say OP11 because it's a clear example of when something absurdly powerful was introduced into the One Piece card game. Blue Purple Luffy in OP11 was an entire caliber above the rest, it felt like. It was a 6,000 power 3 life leader that once he was able to ramp up to 10 dong was effectively drawing 2 cards per turn, but it was much stronger than that because you could choose which card was added to your hand, and also you're able to reorder the top, making things like that 9-cost Sanji into the 9-cost Big Mom absurdly powerful. This 9-cost Mom alone within this deck was able to give you the late game that you needed to actually stabilize and be able to win with the amount of power that you have on your board, which was inevitably too powerful, which is why they ended up banning that card combo. Still, Blue Purple Luffy basically had everything. It had survivability in things like Gum Gum Giant, it had board control with things like 9-Mom, it had mid-game stabilization with, again, things like 9-Mom and 8-cost Katakuri, and also it had absurd late-game board expansion with things like the 9-cost Sanji, and in more recent times, things like the 8-cost Roger. This deck alone defined the OP11 meta, and it was actually to the point where people were playing Bella Betty purely to counter Blue Purple Luffy. Yes, it was good into some other matchups as well, but the reason why people were playing Bella Belabetti was because it was one of the very few winning matchups in the entire One Piece card game into Blue Purple Luffy at the time. This created a meta where you either had to be playing Blue Purple Luffy or you had to be playing something that beat it. And I think that Bandai also tried to counter Blue Purple Luffy in OP12. However, they were unsuccessful. In OP12, things like Green Zoro and Red Rayleigh were also powerful, but they didn't necessarily beat Blue Purple Luffy due to the fact that 9-cost Mom was so powerful in this deck. If you look at things like the 6-cost Kuzang, this is a very powerful card in the context of Blue Kuzang as a deck because effectively it's similar to the 6-cost Hancock, except that you can stop anything, including Monkey D. Luffy's, which of course for Blue Purple Luffy means things like that 9-cost Luffy. But also, interestingly, this card randomly, despite being a blue card, can give itself +1 cost. Why was this? Well, it's because 9-cost Mom was so powerful that things that were 6-cost or less effectively just couldn't exist within this meta. So to have a solid 6-cost 8,000 power body that doesn't have the weakness of just being blown up by 9-cost Mom the second that it's played, they put this extra +1 cost arbitrarily to just make sure that you'd have a better matchup into Blue Purple Luffy. Now, this being said, though, Blue Purple Luffy matchup into Blue Kuzang was still absolutely devastating. 80-20, you never want to hit this matchup as Blue Kuzang, so therefore Blue Kuzang was just basically never played in OP12. But this was one of the first instances where we saw cards that seemed like very clear and direct counters to things that existed before. I didn't really like the way that I was rounding out this video, so I decided to re-script and re-record from this point onwards, so welcome to my home. This is sort of a real-time ban list adjustment, something that clearly Bandai doesn't really know how to do. Blue Purple Luffy was a problem because it was generically really powerful into everything that existed up until this point. In order to make a deck that's even stronger than the generic best deck in the format, like Blue Purple Luffy, is to either make something that's generically even more powerful or make something that very specifically counters it, like we kind of started to see, although they did fail with the 6-cost Kuzang. The first option of just printing a new generically powerful deck in the meta is that you're replacing the old problem with a new one. You're not actually solving the problem, you're still going to have the exact same issue, just with a new coat of paint. On the other hand, option 2 of printing a specific counter to that meta deck is that even if that top 1 deck is RP law level disgustingly powerful, there's no guarantee that you're going to hit that deck within the Swiss round. Even some of the most powerful decks in the past will only have something like a 30% player within the Swiss round, meaning that the other 70% of the time you'd be completely exposed, which means that to make the second option of having a very specific counter to the top deck be viable is if it's generically powerful as well, which is kind of paradoxical because then isn't that just option A? So inherently option B is very difficult to tackle. Either you have the most broken deck that's ever existed within the meta that also counters the strongest deck in the previous meta, or you have something like Blue Kuzan that just does nothing. It's for this reason that in OP13, the anniversary set, we had a new coat of absurdly powerful generic leaders in Black Ema and Red Blue Ace. But the difference between these leaders and the Blue Purple Luffy Belabetti meta was that Belabetti was an option that was found to beat Blue Purple Luffy, whereas in OP13, both Red Blue Ace and Ema, printed within the exact same set, covered each other's weaknesses. Ace is a deck that's inherently weak against removal, but even with all of their characters being immune to removal made it very difficult for any sorts of those decks to exist, making Red Blue Ace very powerful. Conversely, decks that could potentially be good into Emu that are very low to the ground and aggressive are weak against Red Blue Ace due to the fact that he's a 6,000 power leader with insane tankiness. These two decks increase the general standard of decks within the One Piece card game, meaning that if other decks don't reach that level, there's really no reason to play Blue Purple Luffy or Green Zoro or Red Rayleigh because there's just one clear option that you should be playing, and that's Ema or Ace. In OP14 though, we had a very OP06-esque set where the old decks in Ema as well as Ace weren't actually power crept out of the meta, but had new threats they had to deal with in things like Boa Hancock as well as Mihawk. Neither Boa Hancock nor Mihawk were the outstanding best deck within the format, but Ema and Ace weren't necessarily that either. All four of these decks could coexist and help to sort of balance out the power shift that they created in OP13. All in all, I think that OP14 was a rather successful meta, and people who played it, especially more casual players, really did enjoy it. But if Bandai just kept up this trend of printing new strong leaders that slowly phase out the old leaders, like for example if we made a deck that was good into Emu and Ace, but not necessarily great into Mihawk and Hancock, then you can slowly filter out these decks in a more natural way so that people still have choices. While yes, maybe you could still play Ema, but it's a little bit worse into the new decks, or you could probably play Mihawk, but again, that consistency is something you have to worry about. Instead, what they did was print NL. And NL basically phased out all of these decks. All of these decks ended up being phased out because NL was so powerful, is so powerful. We're still in OP15, and I'm afraid that they're just going to keep doing this. Every other set where they're just going to keep printing out more and more powerful cards because they're stuck in this loop where they don't really want to ban cards, which I respect. I don't think that we should be resorting to banning cards constantly, but they keep trying to answer this question of how do you beat the generically powerful leader? How do you beat Blue Purple Luffy? You make something that's generically more powerful. How do you beat Ace and Emu? You make something that's even more powerful generically. And then now you have basically a Yu-Gi-Oh leader in the One Piece card game. And I think that this is sort of setting up a dangerous trap for Bandai because OP17 is the anniversary set. Anniversary sets, Bandai wants to increase the power level of the game. They want to introduce something earth-shattering. Disregarding any leaders from the anniversary set, they printed out the 10-cost Roger, and that card's probably going to be a threat for the rest of time because it's a manga. It's not going to rotate out. I used to enjoy making my deck shiny. I'd get alt arts of the cards that I really like. My Blue Purple Luffy deck was almost entirely shiny. I just think that it was pretty cool. But the reason why I stopped playing high rarity was because the high rarity deck that I would buy would end up being phased out of the meta within the next 3 months or something. And that didn't really feel like I was getting my money's worth out of the cards that I just bought. So now I play low rarity. Additionally, although every time that I mention this, I get a bunch of people in the comments flaming me, I really enjoy playing Emu. The deck is just a lot of fun for me to play. And I feel that because Purple NL is like a 100-0 matchup into Emu, if they have any semblance of a brain fighting the deck, I can't play the deck. It feels like Bandai forced me off the deck that I enjoy playing because they just decided your time is up. And that feels a little bit sad. I didn't make my Emu max rarity because I assumed surely they're going to ban something or surely they're going to just power creep it. And unfortunately, I ended up being right. OP16 is right around the corner, and this is where I want to come back to that option B that I was talking about. Before, we talked about the 6-cost Kuzan, how that was an unsuccessful way of dealing with Blue Purple Luffy in Blue Kuzan. And it seems like they're kind of retrying this idea of introducing counters specifically through cards that existed within decks, rather than just creating full decks that are inherently going to be able to beat things that came before it. One of, but not the only, core problem that NL proposes within a game is the fact that he has all these 1-cost 2000 power characters that can hit for 6000 with your leader effect. These 1-costs that are hand neutral swarm the board and are really, really annoying to deal with from the opponent's perspective, making it so that if the opponent doesn't have the resources to survive, they're just going to fall over to these small characters, disregarding the fact that there's a 6-cost 10,000 power character as well. Though we haven't seen the full OP16 card list, we've seen things like the 6-cost Vista as well as the 1-cost Doc Q that specifically can KO 2 of the opponent's 1-cost or less characters. Imagine a card like this before OP15. This would be the worst card that you've ever seen in your life because there's effectively no 1-cost in the game that you feel like you need to get rid of, and playing a card that does this useless effect just doesn't make any sense. However, because NL exists and because of the way that he plays out the game with these 1-cost characters, now these cards feel like necessities. You need to play these cards to be able to deal with NL's absurdly powerful board. An effect like this, being able to KO the opponent's 1-cost or less against Purple NL, can be extremely devastating, but is completely useless into every single other deck because of the way that every other deck within the One Piece card game functions. You know, a One Piece card game deck and not a Yu-Gi-Oh deck. So that means that things like the 6-cost Vista or the 1-cost Doc Q aren't just generic buffs to the color or generic buffs to the deck to make so that you're just creating a new generically powerful best deck in format. These are cards that are being printed to target the specific weakness of the best deck in the format, meaning that NL isn't just inherently power crept out of the meta by virtue of just losing the sort of rock, paper, scissors of the One Piece card game, nor does it mean that something like Black, Yellow, Teach or Red Ace are inherently going to be the best deck in the format. They have tools that can deal with Purple NL now, and I think that they need to keep doing this if they want to keep the power level of this game in check. All in all, I feel like these types of cards are necessary and probably the correct way of designing counters to the strongest deck in the format without just power creeping the game as a whole, but I do think that it's a sign of bad game design that they're just band-aid fixing retroactively. Still, I'm rather optimistic for OP16, though in my mind at least, none of the leaders except for Black, Yellow, Teach seem like they may be able to contend with Purple NL, but that makes me very excited for Teach. So I'm optimistic for OP16. OP17, though, going to be very, very scary. Let's hope that Bandai wants to support this game as much as we do. Thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.